Morgan, everyone. Tom Nagorski in the Cipher Brief virtual studio, here for a conversation about a question that might have seemed strange to even be asking a couple of months ago. Can Europe go it alone? Meaning, as the Trump administration veers away from its longstanding European allies to some extent and makes something of a pivot towards Moscow, can Europe step up and defend itself against future threats without the assurance that it has had for so long of full-fledged support from Washington? Joining us today from the UK is Nick Fishwick, former senior member of the British Foreign Office and a member of our Cipher Brief expert network. Nick, it's great to have you with us.
Thank you. It's great to be with you.
And maybe we could just start with a broad question. You're you're a keen, not just observer of the transatlantic alliance and relationships, but a pretty good, prognosticator of things. Even after Donald Trump was elected, did you foresee or imagine that we'd be asking these kinds of questions ever, or at least this soon?
Not exactly, but I guess I'd say two things. One is when Cipher Brief asked me something like which country should we pay most attention to around the time of the new year. I can't remember exactly what the question was, but I thought I'd be very clever and say instead of, Russia, China, Iran or whatever, I said it should be the United States, because changes in the United States are going to set the kind of global backcloth against which other changes in global geopolitics will be played out. So I think to that extent, it was for me predictable that changes coming out of DC would reverberate around the world. But more specifically, would I have expected Europe at least to be asking itself questions about going it alone ever in my lifetime? Certainly within the first 4 to 6 weeks of the Trump presidency. I wouldn't have expected that, but again, you've got to go back to this point that what we did expect, again, without trying to be too trite, of the Trump presidency was the unexpected. We know that he's unpredictable. That is not easy for allies. We are still very close allies, and unpredictability in an ally is not ideal, and it's not particularly helpful. But we did know that this was coming. And I think it was foreseeable that the questions posed to the Western alliance by Trump 2.0 would be more searching and more difficult than those posed by Trump 1.0.
Yeah. Now, in that vein, we've seen, again, just over the last month and a half or so, a whole host of statements and pledges. They come almost on a daily basis from different parts of Europe. That all in one way or another speak either to immediately support for Ukraine, but more broadly to what we're talking about, that they're, ready to, whether it's boost their defense spending or just more broadly, go it alone. That's a trite phrase on my part.
Sure.
Has that surprised you? And how, let me stick with the surprise question first.
No, but I am encouraged by it. So the fact that European countries have stepped up is good, including my own country, the UK. However, I think we've got to remember that, the United States, whether it's run by Trump or anybody else, has had a very strong point for many years, which is that European countries, including my own, but more so other European countries, have had the luxury of contracting out their security to the United States and, enjoying a post-Cold War kind of savings dividends. So defense spending, the size of military forces across Europe have reduced significantly over many years, including before the Cold War ended, but particularly since then. I was looking at, without to give away my own age, which is as embarrassing for me as for anybody else. I was looking at the amount of money that the UK the amount of GDP that the UK devoted to defence in the year that I was born, and it was something like 8.5%.
Wow.
It's now, we hope, going up to 2.5%, but that gives you some sense of the perspective
Yeah.
of the change over, let's say, 60 plus years. So I don't blame the American government, whether it's Trump or anybody else, having said for quite a long time, you guys have got to step up. But I am glad that European countries have caught that ball that's been chucked to them, and they are committing themselves to stepping up the amount of payment. You'll see the Germans have just enabled themselves to, ignore their traditional debt ceiling to enable them to spend more on defence. So that's a good sign. But maybe we'll talk about what we mean by going it alone in a minute.
Yeah. Well, let's just stick for a moment to a couple of country by country assessments. And since you raised Germany, their new chancellor, or he's not yet, but Friedrich Merz is expected to be so soon. And you talk about phrases I don't think we ever thought we'd hear. He said on the Sunday, I think it was when he was elected, that his main order of business as the chancellor would be to begin to work towards his phrase, real independence from the United States. You've just mentioned the budgetary factor, but how important is it for the continent to have that kind of language and leadership from the Germans?
Well, I would say it's important, but I would also caution. So on the important side of it, I mean, we're all thinking about Ukraine. And like me, most Cipher Brief subscribers, people watching this, I think will be wanting Ukraine to do as well as it possibly can do out of whatever outcome they get. And we'll have been emotionally and practically, in many cases, supporting Ukraine, not only since the 24th of February 2022, but 8 years before that, when the Russians started using illegal military operations into Ukrainian territory. So we've all been basically behind Ukraine. But of course, what we've learned is that if a democracy assures another democracy or another country that we're with you forever, that by definition can't be true, because a democracy lies within it the ability of the people to go in a completely different direction. And the people of America knew that President Trump was determined to go in a different direction over Ukraine. Therefore, it was meaningless for President Biden and anybody else to say, we're with you forever. We can't be forever because we can't make guarantees like that, and it's misleading to do so. So we just need to bear that in mind. So we are committed to Ukraine, but there are conditions around that support. Still, it's good that Merz said that, because I think it's sending a good signal to President Zelensky that if not forever, then at least hopefully for the long term, Europe is going to stay with Ukraine. And Zelensky may well have worried about whether that commitment was going to be there. The bit that I'm not so comfortable about with statements about going independent is I don't want that to happen. I don't want it to happen ever. I'm not sure it is necessarily going to happen. And if I was in the UK government again now, I would be following a strategy of preparing for US strategic shift, say from Europe to Asia Pacific and to causes closer to America's own homeland. But I would still also be working as hard as I could to preserve what I could of NATO, of the Five Eyes relationship, and of all sorts of military cooperation from the United States. And let's remember that we are still completely dependent on lots of forms of military cooperation and assistance from the United States. So I think to talk too blithely about independence is kind of good in getting in the right mindset, but I don't want people to start assuming that we've given up on the relationship with the US. That would be, for me, that's pretty much close to a worst case scenario.
recognizing excellence in national security. The Cipher Brief Honors Dinner celebrates those who've made a real difference in protecting our nation. It's an unforgettable evening with top leaders in the field. Join us in honoring these remarkable contributions. Reserve your seat now at cipherbriefhonors.com.
And that's maybe a good jumping off point to come to your own country, and not to put you in the position of political analyst of your government there. But Prime Minister Starmer has had some, they say moments can make a leader. And there's a lot, at least in the stuff we read over on this side of the pond, of talk about, even a Churchillian moment for the Prime Minister. What is he, would you think, doing a good job at the balance you just described of trying to, prepare for a brave new world, if you will, but also try to maintain the relationship with Washington?
Yeah, I think he is, and I think there's a way in which there's an extra way, in addition to the ones you just outlined, Tom, where I think he's doing actually something quite interesting to make the most of, an unfortunate situation, a situation that none of us ever wanted. So I think his trip to Washington went very well. I think it was very carefully thought through by the Prime Minister's team. I think they got it right. If nothing else, it was important that President Trump should clearly have enjoyed the visit. And I'm not on the inside, but it seems to me likely that there were very good conversations between our Prime Minister and your head of state. So that's good. At the same time, I know that Starmer and the current leadership of the Labour Party, the current government, are committed to Ukraine. As I say, democratic governments can't use words like forever, but they can use words like for the long term or as long as we're in power. And I'm very confident that this government is committed to Ukraine and it is clearly thinking about, if it happens that there is less American commitment to Ukraine's long-term security, then it's reasonable for the US to tell Europe, you've got to step up. And I think from what I can see of Starmer, whether you call that a Churchill moment or a Keir Starmer moment, I think he's done well in seizing that opportunity. I think the third opportunity that you didn't outline there, Tom, when you were asking that question, so it's an opportunity to respond to the American challenge. It's an opportunity to assure Ukraine. I think there's also an opportunity for us to reposition ourselves constructively with regard to Europe. So Britain pulled out of the European Union. We voted against staying in the European Union in 2016. After a few years, we then did formally drop out of the European Union. So we're not members of the European Union anymore. I think that there's a moment here about cooperation with European colleagues over defence, which will be popular in this country. And I think that will pave the way for a new set of constructive relationships between Britain and European Union countries, notably France, Germany, Italy, Spain, but the other countries as well, it'll provide a new version of cooperation with Europe that might pave the way for cooperation across a different set of issues. So giving an opportunity to set up new positive relationships with Europe post-Brexit. And I think that's an opportunity. I think the Prime Minister's well placed to make the most of that opportunity.
Now, you said a moment ago, back to the go it alone point, that there are many things that the Europeans or Europe as a continent cannot really manage without the United States, at least not right now. What did you have in mind? I think you meant militarily. Is that right?
I mean, militarily. So, we've still got, 100,000 American troops in Europe. Please don't go. So the longer those guys stay, the less likely our enemy, Russia, is to play games with the borders of European countries. Secondly, I think there are issues about, let's say, high-grade weaponry on which we are dependent from with the United States. I think it's true that that Britain and France doesn't have tactical nuclear weapons. If bad things started happening, the Russians proved me wrong and did use, because I don't think they will, but I might be wrong, if they did use tactical nuclear weapons, currently we're in real trouble because we don't have a tactical nuclear response. I think the Americans provide that. And there were very close relationships between US, NATO, senior military people, and obviously European NATO people, and it would be a tragedy to lose that. There's also the Five Eyes intelligence relationship. We know that the Americans are huge providers of intelligence that are used by the other Five Eyes countries, including the UK. We really don't want to lose that. So it's intelligence as well as military support.
Yeah, yeah. And is it, let's again assume the worst or prepare for the worst, if that's what some of the Europeans are doing now. That's a very long-term proposition, is it not, to fill any of those gaps you've just outlined?
Well, I think the intelligence gaps, I mean, I'm assuming that even if the US reorients its strategic priorities, I'm still assuming that there will remain a very close intelligence relationship between the UK and the US. Mm-hmm. And despite all this nonsense about Canada in the 51st state, which frankly I find bizarre and offensive, I assume that the Five Eyes will survive. So I'm assuming that it's in all of those five countries' interest, particularly us, the UK, Canada, Australia, and the US, but also New Zealand, that the Five Eyes gathering survives, possibly in a slightly different form. Possibly, if the US is producing less intelligence on Russia, perhaps it'll have less to share. But we're still going to need it, because I think America is still going to produce high-grade intelligence on Russia, and we need access to that. So I think that's really important that survives. I think other relationships, it's hard to say at this time what those relationships are going to look like, but I'm assuming that they're salvageable. On the other hand, in terms of going it more alone, we've got to remember, and I think I've said this in the Cipher Brief before, the Russian economy is nothing compared to the European economy. I mean, the American economy is very, very roughly comparable in many ways to the European economy in terms of prosperity, industrial output, GDP, and all that sort of thing. There's not a great difference between the US and the European unions, I believe. I think the difference between the European unions and Russians is massive. Mm-hmm. Russia's got a very, very small GDP compared to ours. So and I think they spend about 10% of their budget on military matters. Some people think that is eventually going to lead to a crisis for the Russian economy. Some people think Russia can just keep doing it and that kind of military autarky is sustainable. I don't know the answer to that. But I do know that if we can't, without having to spend anything like what Russia spends on its defense, if we can't increase what we spend and also use our superior technology to military purposes to keep us safe, then we don't deserve freedom.
Okay. I hate to end on a downer like that, so let me ask you another question before we go. You suggested, I think, but tell us that you don't think the damage at the moment is irreparable. And you've made many references to the nature of democracy, and there's change that comes. Can you say for yourself, but also perhaps your countrymen and others, do they view this as a complete break or rupture, or something that is a big but historical blip, shall we say, or something in between?
Well, first of all, I just say that what I previously said, I don't think it is a downer, because I think Europe will respond to it. Okay. If we don't, it'll be pretty shameful. It'll serve us right, but I don't think that's going to happen. I think as regards the relationship with the United States, I mean, I just don't know, because the president is so unpredictable, and I just don't know whether he knows what he's going to do next. But if I was in government now, I'd be, as I say, I'd be planning for the worst, but assuming, if not the best, then something pretty reasonable, that the intelligence relationship will continue, that military cooperation will continue, that there'll be loads of people in the American administration, the intelligence community, Congress, whatever, who will continue to share the values that we and our European colleagues share, and not want to go rushing off into, an abrupt volte-face where suddenly, President Putin's our best friend and we don't like, the new Prime Minister of Canada. I mean, I'm just assuming that's not going to be happening, despite rhetoric that comes out of the White House. So, I don't think it's going to be the worst case, but I think it's right to prepare for activities, statements, policies from the United States that are going to be unwelcome. I mean, that sounds very vague, Tom. I guess I'm trying to say that I really think we should not give up on the relation. I think it's stupid to give up on that. I don't think that we will have to give up on the relationship, including the relationships I outlined to you earlier. But it's unpredictable, and we've got to be prepared for bad things to happen.
Well said. And as always, Nick Fishwick, we really appreciate your insights as a member of our expert network. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for your time, Tom.